Let's first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Now that's really wordy, so we're going to break this down. It says if men were angels, you wouldn't need a government, right? Because if men were perfect, you wouldn't need any sort of way to govern them. They do the right thing all on their own. And then he also says if angels were to govern men, in other words, if we had a perfect leader to appoint, we wouldn't need any sort of controls on government. They do the right thing, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. He says in framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, by imperfect, over imperfect, the great difficulty lies in this. He must first enable the government to control the governed and itself, right? You have to have that tightrope of good government, and it's very, very difficult for governments to walk, and technology makes it even more difficult. How do you protect personal rights while at the same time protecting people? So anyways, or protecting people while protecting personal rights. So that's very hard. But then Washington said this: we must take human nature as we find it. Perfection falls not on the lot of mortals. I missed that one. I usually have these memorized. On a share of mortals. Gosh, guys. Anyways. Now, honest to goodness, though, I'm a little more out of breath than I usually am. I can like feel the blood, doing its best. So, anyways, I live at about 800 feet. So checks and balances are a direct play on human nature that the founding fathers geniusly put in our government. It wasn't unprecedented. There's actually some precedent for checks and balances in especially England. And a lot of great American political thought comes from some very, very good British political thought. But our system of checks and balances is a direct play on human nature. We've got three branches of government. Who can name them for me? Or name one. We'll throw out 3 starters here. Okay? Judicial. Yeah. Legislative and executive. That one was a little high. I'll take the fault of that one. So anyways, those are exactly right. You've got the legislative branch writes laws, executive branch passes them into effect, and the judicial branch, adjudicates judicial disputes, and also through judicial review in the United States, they check if a law is actually constitutionally valid. So that's what checks and balances are there for, and they're kind of like 3 cords bound together by the center. And when one pulls away, the other two have the obligation and the power to pull back. And as a result, it never gets any bigger than it originally was. Now, we see this system prone to abuses, right? But it's also an ingenious thing, and it's the idea that you can't corrupt all three branches of government at once, at least not very easily. And even if they are, the system itself will bog down the march of evil during that time. And James Madison said this: an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among the several bodies of magistracy that no one could transcend the legally limits without being effectually checked and restrained by the others. So it's a direct play on human nature, because they understood that humans are wicked, and they put that right into the laws to understand that you have to have some sort of check on human wickedness. But what we're talking about people, what does it mean for people to be equal? Because this is something that's certainly drilled into American thought, that all men are created equal, right? And it's in Western thought, as today, just a staple of it. But what does it mean to be equal? Because your worldview presuppositions matter, because how you understand the world dictates how you'll understand this equality. So what does it mean for humans to be created equal? Let's talk about our 2 main worldviews. So under the Christian worldview, God created man and he gives him the image of God, right? So as a result, there's this external reference point, the eternal reference point that says you matter. So under the Christian worldview, you always matter, and it can't rightly be said that even though you and I, we look different, we talk different, we're different people, it can't rightly be said that anyone in this room is more valuable than another person, right? Because there's this external point of reference. You absolutely matter. But let's take that external point of reference away. Now you find that humans look different, they walk different, they talk different. And you're left with two startling results that you can bring from that. And the first one is probably the most terrible. If 2 people look different and are capable of different things, what do you do when you have 2 cars that look different and are capable of different things? You give them different values. You decide one is more worthwhile than the other. And you cannot do that with people. But once you've denied God, you're just trying to be intellectually consistent with yourself. And of course, that's been the impetus for a lot of terrible human rights violations throughout history, right? But then moving from there, the other one is this, and it's a little sneakier. You say, hey, if 2 people look different and they have different things, it is society which has done this to them. In other words, if one person has money while another person doesn't, society has done this to them. It's the government's job to even this out. And even worse, you say if two people are somehow different, it is society that has done it. And you'll say, well, men and women are different. And instead of being both individually created magnificently, like by God, to complement each other, you think that men and women must inherently be the same. And it's that sort of thinking, or your form of equality is not equality under God, not equality under the law. It's equality of position, equality of everything. It means uniformity. But equality does not mean uniformity. It simply can't. And then from our understanding of equality, we then have to understand equally what? Well, equal having equal rights, usually, and I said equal protection under the law, and that's what rights are for, and they should be equally applied. But what are rights? So why don't we throw out some rights here? Who can name some rights for me? For a pink one, consensus the best, yeah. Yeah, right there.
The right to bear arms.
That's not get it every single time. Yep, spot on. Others? Yeah.
Life.
Yep. It matters. Yeah.
Straight out of the Bill of Rights, right to a speedy trial.
Yeah, right to a speedy trial. I seldom get that one, but well done.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, First Amendment. Any others? Yeah.
Petition and, well, there's others. There's the first one, which is 5, I believe. But the petition and, there's the petition amendment, assembly. I can't remember the last two.
Yeah, no, you're right on the doorstep of one I really wanted to talk about, so I'm going to come back to that in a second. I know exactly
I'll
where
try
you're
to see
going.
if I can remember the rest of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Pursuit of happiness.
Pursuit of happiness. You remember your Declaration of Independence. Yeah.
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of religion.
I got them.
Okay.
Speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly.
Right. And I want to focus on the petition there. Do we have another one over here? Okay. Now, one of my favorite answers I ever got was from a fellow. He was probably just like 9 years old, much younger than usually are at my talks. But he raised his hand, I was like, what you got, bud? And he says, the right to peacefully petition the government for the redress of grievances. I was like, spot on, bud. But I want you to think about that, because it's so seldom thought of, that we sometimes don't even think about rights. We're thinking, right to bear arms, right to religion, freedom of speech. And we kind of think of those three. But think about this one, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. We glaze over it because it's just kind of founding fathers speak. But think about it. In the United States, an ordinary citizen can say, wait a second, that's a really bad law, that's pretty bad for me. Can go to the court, sue the federal government, and win. That's remarkable. And it's nearly unprecedented in human history. The British had some precedent of this, but otherwise it's pretty hard to find. So think about this, though. When Mao takes over China, the Maoist revolution, right? He decides that he wants to hear from all his dissenters. Like, hey, if anyone has a problem with the government, please write us and let us know. and what he did is you think of how it's called something like the Thousand Flowers Initiative. And he says, well, if everyone has a problem with the government, please let us know. We'd love to talk with you. And then everyone writes to the government, says, hey, we've got these problems, and he rounds them all up and puts them in re-education camps. And that is the more natural flow of human history. That's way more common for a government to behave like that than it is for one to behave like the United States government. So rights are important, but here's the big question. Where do rights come from? Who can tell me? Don't. God. Starburst, no Starburst.
Starburst.
Yeah. I asked the parents because you never know. But yeah, so they come from God. Because think about this. If under the Christian worldview you have these rights that have been given to you, and there's no other being that can give these to you except that which created you. So if God really knit you together in your mother's womb, in there he wove in human rights. And people can violate these rights, but they cannot take them away. All they can do is sin and violate them, and that's on them. It's not on the other person. But let's take away God from this situation. And you still want to believe that humans have rights. So in turn, what do? Well, like I said before, you remove the babysitter, or you remove the parent, the babysitter becomes the parent. And as a result, government now becomes the giver of rights. And instead of just protecting rights, governments give rights. But if the government can give a right, they can with equal validity take a right away, and they can apply rights differently based upon the color of your skin or the color of whatever. And they can go ahead and just decide what's right and wrong. And we see this all over the place. And that's a very, very dangerous precedent. The United Nations likes to think it's the conscience of the world, and they have a Declaration of Human Rights. And a lot of them are very, very good, and some of them I play with just in the wording and just in the margins. But you get to number, probably 23 is in my mind, it's the right to vacation outside of country. which is a heck of a right. And I sure don't think it belongs right next to the right to freedom of religion. But if you believe that somehow government is the giver of rights, well then all these nice sounding things can suddenly be put in there. So that's where that comes from. But I want you to think about this. Like I said, you take away the babysitter, the government, or you take away the parent, the babysitter becomes the parent. So, in this case, instead of God the Heavenly Father, we have government our Father. Do you remember what the Germans called Germany? The fatherland. Somehow Germany is our father. Now it's not really bad, but it became, it eventually was used for pretty terrible means. But do you remember what the Soviets called Russia? Mother Russia. Somehow Russia is our mother. And it's a very dangerous line of thoughts. Now to express patriotism and love of country is not bad, but to express some deification of your country is where the problem starts. So on the topic of rights, we see in the Declaration of Independence that in America we recognize that they come from God. It's written, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to secure these rights, not create these rights, not to give these rights, secure these rights as in to protect. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it cannot be,
I think the key word there is truth, because when you decouple truth from rights, you get man's opinion, as opposed to what is granted by God, which is truth. And I think that's why they started, we hold these truths. It's a very important word there, those truths, to be self-evident, because it's written in your heart by your Creator, and that's the origin of the source. So I think that was very carefully worded to be spot on. So then you couple the word rights, certain unalienable rights. So, you have that truth, Creator, and rights in the correct place. Because when you decouple those, you end up with chaos.
yeah, that's very well said. And actually, I come back to that in just a couple of slides, so I'm glad you made the segue. That's great. But then Alexander Hamilton said this, in very beautiful language. He said, the sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam, and the whole volume of human nature as by the hand of the divinity itself, as with a sunbeam, and the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself. It can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. So it's really beautiful language. He's saying, hey, it's written as with a sunbeam. But real quick, side note, he says the divinity itself. And so many people point at it and say, hey, look at that. He's a deist, right? Because he doesn't say God. And it's just a beautiful sort of language that they had back then that we've since lost. We've lost a lot of the eloquence of the English language, especially, I think, in the United States and then probably Australia. But, so we can't lose that. And even Alexander Hamilton, some of his last words were, saying that he has peace in the gospel of Jesus Christ after that scoundrel Aaron Burr shot him. So, and then come back to the point you made. I say here to the democracy for which it stands, and it all ties in. I connect directly types of governments to human rights, and I want to draw this connection because almost no one ever makes this connection, but I think it's very real, and I hope you guys understand it. Now, obviously, these are the wrong words. I draw that from the Pledge of Allegiance to the democracy for which it stands. Who can tell me the right word?
To the Republic.
To the republic for which it stands, right? See, that's your fault again. That's terrible. You'll get better.
Don't go to enough youth groups where you pitch out.
Yeah, you're right. That should be a more standard practice. I'm more on that right time. But it's a republic, right? But what does it mean to be a republic? Well, John Adams said this, and it's very well said, that there's no good government but what is republic, and he doesn't mean the Republican Party. He wasn't around yet. He means as in the republic. He says that the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so. For the true idea of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. Because an empire of men is a democracy, right? So if we take this town or take this room, transform it into a democracy, now 51% of the people now become divine. Because 51% is now the rule of law. Because human consensus is now the greatest form of truth. That now human consensus is the great arbiter of truth in a nation. So if you take that, let's apply it to this town. Let's say the other 51% of us don't like what the other 49% have to say. Well, we can go ahead and just pass a law that says they can't talk and punish them for violating it, right? It will be totally valid because there's no higher authority which that government appeals to. It's a democracy. Even if it's a representative democracy, it's just a democracy that they've diffused through representation, where just a few people now have the right to have the opinions that shape truth in the world. But then what's a republic? Well, a republic is different because a republic reaches out to a truth that transcends human understanding, or doesn't, not necessarily understanding because it's been revealed to us. You have to have been able to understand it. There's some divine revelation there for a lot of this. But let's say, for example, we live in a country, well, yeah, the United States even, where 1% of the people are saying something that's deeply unpopular with the other 99%. But as long as they're not violent and not violating any other laws, they totally have the right to say it. And not only that, the police, who are likely not to agree with this 1%, are going to show up and protect this person because they have a right. And even if 99% of us want all the possessions of some 1% somewhere, well, unless you count taxes, but it's unless, even if some vast majority wants the possessions of the other people, they can't just pass a law that says they can walk into their house and take it, right? So there's some greater truth, because a republic reaches out to a divine foothold and says, well, maybe human rights are sacred because there's a God that put them into place. And the way you protect that usually is with a constitution. And that's why we're a republic, in a very meaningful way, and it's an important word. Yeah?
Well, my understanding is that some of the